Welcome back, everybody. If you're joining us for the first time, then welcome to the Professional Evil Insights. And if you've been with us before, then welcome back. So today we have what sounds like a lot of alphabet soup. We have how to stay ahead of the curve of the changing regulatory landscape. Really scary, lots of big words there. We couldn't even fit the title on one line, apparently. So it wraps all the way around. So today we have Nathan Sweaney and Bill McCauley joining us. Both are senior consultants. Nathan is a principal consultant with Secure Ideas. And they both have quite a bit of experience in different areas of regulatory compliance as it relates to penetration testing, especially. So we thought we would start a conversation on this, and we have a presentation. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it straight over to you guys. I know that you have a bunch of slides to talk through, so let's go ahead.
Cool. All right. In that case, I will go ahead and get started with introductions. So my name is Bill McCauley. I've been with Secure Ideas since 2018, roughly an hour and a half outside of the DFW Dallas area. Had a background in we were mentioning about compliance, and I did compliance with the energy industry for NERC compliance for several years. But especially with military background, been around all different types, especially DoD contracting related pieces. So while there's several other of these that we're going to talk about that I haven't had a chance to actually enforce or actually implement, I've absolutely been around several of these before. So it's going to be interesting. It's going to be fun. And we were talking about alphabet soup and what to do with compliance. My first recommendation is to offload all compliance to somebody else. let somebody else take care of it, right? Yeah. As far as interests, veteran, I got a mini farm, got chickens all over the place and things like that. So with that, I'll go ahead and let Nathan take over.
Awesome. Well, as Jason said, my name's Nathan Sweaney. I'm one of the principal security consultants here at Secure Ideas. Been around for a little over 10 years now. I think it was 10 years back in April. I come at compliance from a little bit of a different perspective. I started out in the point of sale industry, and nobody else wanted to deal with PCI when it was first starting out. So the very first version of PCI, I got pulled. Well, the PCI DSS specifically, I got pulled into. And then that really kind of led into security from there. I learned about penetration testing and other types of assessments and whatnot. And then eventually that's how I ended up at Secure Ideas. But I've done a lot with, through my time here at SI, a lot with different financial services companies and some other different types of compliance as well. Just the nature of our consulting, we work with whatever compliance or standards or whatever our clients have to deal with. So we're often translating and addressing those issues and whatnot. So, let's jump into it and let's just talk. Well, our plan for today is to talk about a whole bunch of different types of changes that have happened in 2023, right? And yay, Stanley's awesome. If you're not an Office fan, I'm sorry. Pause the webinar. Go watch The Office. Fight through the first season. It's a little rough, and then then you'll enjoy it. Come back, and then we can talk about regulations.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I'm assuming you.
Say again. Sorry.
Have you watched The Office?
Parts of it.
Parts of it. Oh my gosh, Bill. Okay.
See, I haven't even gone through the whole thing yet.
As your supervisor, I am directing that you have a responsibility now. You need to go watch all of The Office. That's going to be part of your Secure Ideas training requirements. No, but yes. When we talk about regulations, the one thing about regulations is they constantly change, and you have to stay on top of it. You have to keep up with what's going on, what the latest greatest is. So there are some things to keep in mind, right? Because a lot of times we're like, who cares about regulations? Why do I need to deal with this? Regulations enforce best practices, right? We all have good intentions. We all we've often talked here at Secure Ideas about how we have things that need to get done, and sometimes things don't get done because we're doing other things that are probably also important, but are they the most important, right? Often we're busy doing things that maybe aren't the most important thing, but it's trying to prioritize. regulations and compliance and all that, it forces us to prioritize some of those best practices. Maybe not the best practices all the time, right? Like we've all dealt with PCI or whatever that requires us to do something stupid, and so we're spending budget there instead of where it should be. But it at least sets like a minimum level that we're gonna keep up with. And exactly like playing with the flipper zeros. Yeah, I actually don't know where I set mine aside somewhere. The other thing that compliance and regulations do is they provide some level of consistency. So, by having policies in place, by having assessments and audits and whatnot, it maintains that everybody that falls within that compliance, regulatory environment, that they're at least meeting a minimum standard kind of thing.
And that standardization helps, especially if those businesses have to interact on any level, because now you're working with the same controls. Now you're working with the same restrictions. Right now, at least things are more easily integratable.
Yep. And then from a protective perspective, like for consumers. Did I lock up? Okay, I paused for a second. My internet's been going out today a few times, and so I was worried that it went away for a minute, but I think I'm good. From a consumer protection perspective, compliance requirements and regulations provide like that protection against negligence. So if you're guaranteed that every business that you deal with is going to at least have to meet certain requirements to stay in business or to not get fined, that gives you some comfort that they're not, they're going to protect your data properly. And that sort of thing. So there's some good that comes with it. But anyway, I don't know. Anything else I missed, Bill? Does that cover it?
No, I think that's good. At least for intentions, regardless of the specific rules of any compliance standard or regulation, at least the ultimate goal is to protect finances and protect sensitive information, right? Protect those types of things.
Healthcare data, critical infrastructure, whatever it might be. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Cool. So here's what we did. We basically said, okay, what are the biggest things that have changed in 2023? What are the things that we can talk about updates on? What are things that just in general, if you're an IT security professional, you should be aware of? Some of these probably apply to some of you. Some of them may not apply at all to some of you. But we're just going to kind of walk through these over the next 40 minutes or so, 45 minutes, and just kind of give you like, hey, if this applies to you, here's the basics that you need to know. We obviously don't have time to go into super detail, but yeah, we're gonna just kind of walk through those.
Yep. And to add to that, some of those, or some of the ones we're going to talk about, there is a good level of complexity in some of these. Right. There's a lot of nuance, and so based on the time constraints, we want to make sure to focus on the highlights and talk through a few of these.
Yep.
And so I'm actually going to go ahead and start out here with the GLBA compliance requirements for the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. Now, originally, this was meant to deal with financial institutions. Now, this is going to be a different level. So you've got PCI that's going to handle banks for a higher degree of transactions and financial services. This is more along the lines of people that offer financial services or products like loans, like investment advice, insurance for other consumers. You'll have some mortgage lenders. Now, there's a couple of these for at least Target to be aware of, is that non-federally insured credit unions, so something that's not federally insured, or investment advisors that are not required to register with your SEC. SEC is your Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC Securities.
Yep.
Yes, security, which we're going to talk about later. But you'll notice that some of these compliance standards and regulations will impact different areas, and some of those may overlap. For example, in the places where SEC doesn't fit, GLBA may be applicable. And so normally if you're required to adhere to any of these types of compliance responsibilities, you're going to have someone in your organization who is the expert. They are going to be the subject matter expert on this compliance or this regulation or this standard, or what that means to your business and your organization. Now, recently, GLBA has actually been around for quite a while. And things like education. So you've got colleges, you've got universities, and auto dealerships. So you've got different industries that handle like student loans, or you've got auto loans, or you're trying to finance something for your next vehicle. Those types of interactions, we want to make sure that the goal here is that that information that's being used between these smaller organizations who may not have the budget or the people for, say, a full-blown finance department or to fall under PCI compliance, that there's protecting this information in an appropriate way. So I've got on here some of the main goals of the GLBA. And really, it's just to ensure that the confidentiality for your information is protected. You're looking for different threats against the integrity. You're going to notice a lot of CISP type language here, where you've got your confidentiality, integrity, availability of that information, and what the authorized or unauthorized impacts of that are. Now, this one in particular, there's been some changes. It started out 2021. The FTC made some recommendations on what to change. The original enforcement date for that was December 9th of 2022. So this past December, there was some pushback. There were some people, some entities. Well, that's probably the best term for it, which pushed back like, we're not going to be ready for this. There's a few things that we need to get done. This enforcement date actually got pushed out to just recently, June 9th, 2023. So starting June 9th, 2023, there's a handful of things that still need, or that now need to be done. When you have like a general requirement that says, hey, protect the information based on your environment, do best practices, right? It doesn't go into detail. This actually breaks it down. And so there were 9 specific things that were added to this. And I'm just going to go through them very, very briefly, just so that you get a gist of what the focus of these changes are supposed to be. So the first one is have a qualified individual who's supposed to supervise your information security program. Now, qualified individual, from what I understand, looking back through some of the language of this, originally this was supposed to be the CISO, but they changed that to say qualified individual so that it's not requiring a specific, right? It's not requiring a specific role, but it's looking for someone with the knowledge and experience to actually do something with that information security program. There's some risk assessments that have to be conducted. They have to design and implement safeguards to control risks that are identified during that risk assessment. They have another rule that's been added for regularly monitor and test safeguards. I'm actually going to circle back to this one. This was number 4, regularly monitor and test safeguards. I'll circle back to that because it has a practical impact on this. You've got another for training staff. You want to make sure that your staff are familiar with data protection best practices. How do they handle any kind of sensitive information or sensitive data? You'll have monitor your service providers. So your vendors, people who are going to, you want to monitor those who are providing those services. You start thinking supply chain, SBOM, right? You start thinking of other things that are outside of the actual entity and how it would affect. This is their way of making these other institutions, these other entities, education, auto, whatever, to start paying attention to third-party vendors. You got to keep your information security program current. You actually have to create a written response plan. So the response plan can't be, oh, so-and-so is supposed to call so-and-so, and then this person calls this person, and this person lets everybody know. You actually have to have a written, detailed incident response plan. Now, the final one, which is probably one of the most interesting to me, is that qualified individual that you had to designate at the very beginning of this, that person has to report to the board of directors. And one of the main reasons for this particular rule being added is so that when your board of directors, when the people who are responsible for making decisions, they actually have the information available to make good decisions for the security, right? The posture, right. the upcoming controls, the decisions you have to make for maintaining your security program. That way they at least have information based on good and right for your qualified information, for your information security, for your risk assessments. they actually have some good information so that when they're making those security decisions, they have something concrete to fall back on.
I'm noticing similar language across some of the other, like the SEC stuff, and we'll talk about
That's
that
exactly
in a few
right.
minutes, and the New York Department of Financial Services, and we're seeing a lot of similar additions and amendments, I guess, to some of these regulations.
Well, that and not only not just seeing those, but I think that actually points to, when we talk to companies about, hey, what is your minimum baseline? What is the minimum thing that you need to be able to do to say that we've done the basic of securing our network, our application, whatever it happens to be. I think this is actually a good step towards raising that minimum baseline for,
yeah.
And this would affect a lot of small to medium businesses, because normally the larger ones are going to have, they're going to have things dedicated specifically to these types of programs.
Yep. I think what we're seeing a lot is, at least in the U.S., I'm sure we have some non-U.S. based listeners, but within the U.S., there's not a lot of competency in Washington to be able to pass, higher level. You like the way I said that?
That was good.
More universal security controls, regulations, that sort of thing. Neither the Republican or the Democratic side are able to get anything pushed through. But what we're starting to see is at the state level, at some of these lower levels, a little bit more like they're all kind of congealing on the same language and the same, like, hey, here's the best practices that everybody should be doing.
Yeah. And so, we actually did a recent webinar, me and John, with and it compared the recent differences between small and large businesses. And the gap between them is decreasing because we're using the same technologies. We're all using Active Directory, right? We're using the same tools, and therefore, as an attacker, it doesn't matter if they're going after a large, medium, or small business. It's all basically the same type of environments that they're targeting. So
there's a commoditization process of security controls that are finally getting down to those SMBs, and making some of that stuff practical.
Yeah.
So let's jump to PCI and talk about that a little bit.
I have one last thing. I mentioned number 4 for regulatory monitor. Test safeguards. All of these other controls that are going to be required for that are required for GLBA, most of those can be done in-house. This is the only one that will require you to go out to a vendor. And the reason for that is they give 2 scenarios. One, you either have to continuously monitor your own environment, anything related to GLBA assets, or you have to have 2 vulnerability assessments and a penetration test in a year. So all of those other controls, most of that can be done in-house. This is the only one that has the potential for pushing out to vendors, something outside of your organization.
Good call out. Do you know anybody that does that sort of thing?
I've heard 1 or 2.
Yeah. All right, let's jump over and talk about PCI now for a little bit. So PCI is one of those that people either love it or hate it. I think most people probably tend to hate it. I've been around, involved with it enough that I can at least appreciate what it's done. PCI differs than, I think, all the other regulations that we're going to talk about, because it's not a legal regulation, right? It's not a governing body that is pushing it out. It's a contractual obligation between merchants and the card brands. There's some more players involved, but basically that contractual obligation is significantly different, because if you fail to meet your obligations, you're not going to go to jail. You're not going to get sued by the FTC or something like that. You're just going to get fined and maybe not be able to take credit cards anymore. So it's a different enforcement model. There's a huge alphabet soup, and we could talk about PCI forever. In fact, I actually have a class coming up in a couple of weeks, I think. I want to say it's September 3rd, but I'm not 100% sure on that. With Anti-Siphon, where I'll be doing a kind of an introduction to PCI. And that's a pay what you can model. Yeah. So just a high level, like, let's talk about all the standards and controls and people and all that. So if you're not,
I think you skipped out there for a second. There he is. Sounds like you're back.
Looks like we may have lost Nathan. We'll just give him a moment.
Yep. He had a backup in case the ISP sabotaged his webcast.
Yeah, I'm sure he'll jump over to that. In the meantime, I'm going to take that, put a link to that PCI 101 course. I think this is the right one, but I don't see the dates for it. October 3rd.
I got you.
So I'm going to put that in the chat here. So that's a, I want to say it's a 4-hour-long course. Yep.
Gotcha.
So,
well, I would say what I could do with this while we wait for Nathan is I can jump ahead to the next one, and then have him come back and finish.
We can do that. Yeah. Why don't we go ahead and do that?
Okay. We will totally do that. So SEC. SEC is going to be the Securities and Exchange Commission, and this is going to be one of those that is getting to a lot of nuance. And most of the people who would be affected by this are probably going to have official channels that they're going to deal with day in and day out. However, as a high level on this, the target audience is for SEC registrants. Now, the way this goes is that recently the Securities and Exchange Commission has adopted some new rules that are requiring these registrants. So this is going to be brokers, this is going to be dealers, people who offer or sell securities. Now, by definition, the security, this is more of a broad term that gets used, but it's going to apply to a wide array of investments, a wide range of investments, stocks, bonds, notes, limited partnerships for interests or investment contracts, things of that nature. And there's actually, if you decide to look it up, there is an ongoing court case right now with a company called Coinbase. And one of the key objectives of that case is to get clarification on some of these. So there are aspects of the SEC regulations that have come down that say this is security. And so when that actually gets put into practice, because you're dealing with securities, you're dealing with commodities, all different, and the definition on this matters, and it varies by interpretation. And so one of the core objectives is to get clarification on what the SEC considers very specifically to be a security. For example, does Bitcoin, does Ethereum, right? Do those count? And if they do, to what degree, right? Under what conditions does that affect you? And so high level, really the new changes on this are they've required that registrants disclose material. Again, this is another one of those words that can be interpreted. If you've worked with compliance, you've got the language, and then you've got the interpretation of that language. What does that actually mean? And so you have to disclose material cybersecurity incidents that you experience, and you have to disclose this on an annual basis. Only that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so this is the new information that was released. Was it last month that came out?
This was in. So there's a there's a number of dates on this one. One of them is December 15th, 2023, because the forms that they're using will not be required until either December 15th, if it's like a 10K or a 20F. And then you've got other forms like your 8K that are December 18th. And then if it's a smalling reporting company, then it's 180 days, right? There's a whole spread of when this date would be enforceable.
Oh, when it becomes enforceable. Okay.
Right. Smaller companies, if they're reporting, they have an additional 180 days, an additional 6 months before they have to disclose it. And then you've got others, if it's compliance, then it's going to vary based on some of the tags and some of the different disclosure requirements. For example, here's a good example. If your disclosure of a cybersecurity incident or event or that type of information happens, if there is determined to be, or if you can prove that there is going to be a impact to DoD or impact to national security, then you're allowed to waive that. The problem is you actually have to submit that in writing to the SEC, to the registrar, before you can actually do it. And normally, if something happens, I think you've got 2 or 3 days. You've got a very small window to actually disclose that information.
Right.
And so some of the rules that happen with that are they can come about very quickly. The biggest change to this is, what does material mean? How do you define that? What is a material impact? And then what is the scope? What is the nature? What is the timing of a security incident or a breach that's happened? You've got 4 days to compile that and then get that submitted.
Well, that's my understanding as well. I was under the impression that time frame, though, was from when it was determined to be a material incident, right? So it's not,
Yes.
Hey, we suffered an incident, we know nothing about it, you have 4 days to report
That's
it.
exactly correct.
That's not exactly it. It's from the time where you determine, hey, wait, there was a material
That's exactly right.
Material information was disclosed, that sort of thing. And so, hey, welcome back, Nathan.
Hey.
I don't know when I lost you. I saw Bill's video go blank, and I thought, oh no, we lost Bill. And I talked for 5 minutes, and then I realized, oh wait, maybe it's me that's off.
Yes, we skipped ahead, and we figured we would go back because you were maybe
idea.
a minute or two into the PCI slide.
Oh no. Okay. Sorry about that. We'll go ahead and finish SEC, and then we'll circle back.
Gotcha. Okay, so this one is just about wrapped up. Another thing that this is going to require the registrants to do is describe their processes that are used to identify. So what process do you use to identify those risks, those cybersecurity threats? And then what is the likelihood and what is the impact that that's going to have on the company? So there's some language in there that I can understand why there would be a court case involved with Coinbase. I can understand how there would be some ambiguity there. So some things to be aware of. Hopefully they're going to have some more clarification on some of this coming up in the next few months. But until then, that's probably a good overview for this.
Awesome.
Yeah.
All right,
So
let
Nathan,
me rewind.
We're back
Okay.
at PCI.
Okay, so I don't know how much you got before I dropped, but the two big changes that are significant in 2023 is the implementation of DSS 4.0. So it was actually released in, I think, March of 2022, with the expectation that you have to comply with it and be tested with it by 2025. What that means is that if you're doing validation in 2024, starting in Q1, you have to be validated against 4.0, or else when Q1 2024 hits, you won't be in compliance. So starting this January, we got about 4 or 5 months. If you've been putting it off, it's time to move to 4.0. You've got to do that. Now, target audience, this applies specifically to merchants, but the PCI Council and the card brands have been expanding that scope increasingly, with every version. And so this also applies to service providers, to anybody that in any way interacts with or services the networks, any of the environment. They call it the cardholder data environment, the CDE. Anybody that deals with that has to basically comply with some subset of the data security standard. Let's see. Though there were also a couple of upcoming dates or effective dates. Yeah, when the standard first came out in 2022, I think those have all passed now. So, for example, there was a requirement that service providers have to do additional validation scanning twice a year instead of once a year, and I think that was going to go live as of, I'm making up the date, let's say July 2023. I think that might have been accurate. That has now passed, so it has to happen. Just some stuff like that. So overall, the DSS changes are really good. They consolidated and standardized a bunch of stuff. So like 1.1 says, hey, here's the requirements for this set of sub requirements. You've got to have it documented. Somebody's got to be in charge of it, blah, blah, blah. And then 1.2 basically says that person has to know what they're doing. They have to be trained on this. They have to be familiar with it. And then 2.1 says the same thing. You've got to have it documented, blah, blah, blah. 2.2 says, hey, this person has to be assigned to it. They have to be trained on it. They have to be responsible, all that. 3.1, 3.2, right? So they've done a really good job of making the standard more consistent and easier to read. There have also been some simplifying of some of the requirements that were previously really hard to comply with in some areas. So like a good example is the file integrity monitoring. That was one that people always struggled with, and it was really vague in the old version of the standard. In the newer standard, they basically said, you have to do this, and here's the intent. And if you don't do it exactly like this, you at least you have to meet this intent. And here's some alternative ways that you could do that. So it's actually easier to comply with 4.0 than maybe some of the older versions. The other big change is the software security framework. So this replaces the old version, the payment application data security standard, which it was like the second standard that came out after the DSS back in 2008, I think. The PADSS was just kind of showing its age. It wasn't applicable to all different types of applications and environments. So there's two components to the SSF. It's the secure software standard that basically says if you develop applications in any way that affect or interact with cardholder data, you've got to comply with the standard. The second part of it is the secure software lifecycle. So if you have a software development lifecycle, it has to comply with these certain things, right? You've got standardization for how you do development. You've got an inventory of libraries. You've got code reviews and audits and testing. And, here's how your continuous integration should work, that kind of thing. So those two components basically kind of complement each other and are designed to make applications better. I will say I really like the overall software security framework. I think it's really applicable to a lot more than just payment applications. And they've also made it modular. So, they've got like some core requirements, and then here's some, if you use this type of component, here's this module that applies, or if you use this other, here's this other module, stuff like that. So good things there. If you deal with application security, you definitely want to check that out. Let's move on. I think that takes us to GDPR then, right?
Nathan, before we switch, sure. I just want to put another plug in for your course. I did put the link for it in the public chat here, so everybody can see that there. Are you going to be, I'm assuming that you're going to be covering DSS4 in more detail in that course, right?
So, yeah. So I thank you for saying that, because I gave a big, long spiel for it several minutes ago when I was offline. But that's upcoming. We'll provide the link there. What that course is, it's a high level understanding of what's included in PCI. Because a lot of people, when they say PCI, they just mean data security standard. That's all they know, right? The standard that's required for merchants and service providers to comply with. But there's a lot more to it. There's, I think, 17 or 18 different standards. There's all types of qualified professionals and listings of validated solutions and components and all that kind of stuff. So that course is a kind of a high level walkthrough of here's all the different components. If you have responsibility for PCI in any way, it's a kind of a level set of here's all these different things. We don't get super deep into each one of them, but we do spend a little bit more time with the data security standard, kind of walking through at a high level that it's broken down into 12 requirements. And then each of those requirements has, I want to say there's like 280 or something total sub requirements. And so we'll summarize that. It's not super deep. It's only a 4-hour course. But yeah, that would be great for people to join in on.
And that is, looks like October 3rd is when it's, All right, cool.
Okay, so let's jump back to GDPR. We had this all set up so we could switch back and forth, and my internet went and broke it. So let's talk about GDPR. There are not a lot of big changes here, but there's one big thing that we wanted to make sure everybody was aware of. So when GDPR first came out, this is the EU General Data Protection Regulation. Basically, this is the primary privacy law that governs all EU, not just EU countries, but countries that service in any way EU citizens. Like most government regulations, the law is fairly vague in a lot of ways. Even things like does an IP address count as personally identifiable information? And they basically said yes in some cases. So a lot of what that conversation led into was, hey, we're going to have to wait until there are violations and it goes to court and they argue about does this count or not. And so that's where a lot of the, hey, here's what the law says, but we're going to have to wait and see what the lawyers and judges decide this is actually implemented. HIPAA was the same way. HIPAA is very vague, and it's taken time and legal precedents for us to figure out, okay, do you have to do this or can you do that? The reason that this matters in 2023 is in May, we hit GDPR's 5-year anniversary from when it was first passed.
Oh, really?
Right before then, just a few days before then, I think it was May 22nd, Meta, the company that owns Facebook and Instagram and all that, they were fined 1.2 billion euros. That's billion with a B. That's a big number. I remember somebody told me one time anything times a million is a lot. I think the same fits for a billion, right? Obviously, Meta said, yeah, BS, we're not going to pay that. We're not responsible for that or whatever. But here's where it kind of came into play. I think it's the Ireland Data Privacy Commission basically said they are taking European citizens' data and sending it to the US and not protecting it appropriately. They're not securing that information properly as it's being passed to the US. Now, Facebook is arguing back and saying, yes, we are. This is BS or whatever. And we actually linked that last link there is to Facebook's response to it, or Meta's response to it now. But this has huge implications for a lot of people. $1.2 billion is a lot. The GDPR, the fines, if you're found to breach one of the requirements, it's up to $20 million, or I'm sorry, 20 million euros, or 4% of your annual revenue, worldwide revenue. But it's whichever is greater, not whichever is least. It's 4% of worldwide revenue or 20 million euros, whichever is greater. So that's where we get the $1.2 billion, which is a lot. So this is going to have a lot of implications for companies that work internationally, and especially people that share data across data centers or move data from, hey, this US based, this European based subsidiary to maybe this US based one or whatever. There's going to be a lot of interesting stuff here. Obviously, this hasn't gone through the court system yet, but you'll definitely want to watch out on this. I also wanted to mention, it's not quite GDPR related, but the UK is in the process of passing their own version of GDPR. You remember when the whole Brexit thing happened, and there was a lot of conversation about, does GDPR still apply? And the UK basically said, no, it doesn't. We're going to do our own thing. So theirs is called the Data Protection Digital Information Bill. It's still working through their parliament, and it hasn't been passed yet. But that's going to add some additional complexity because it's just one more really complex regulation that you have to comply with. And I think the big frustrations right now that are being argued over is, how does this contradict the GDPR in some ways? And, how do you comply with both and that kind of stuff? So they're working through that. You'll definitely want to keep an eye out for that. On the US side, let's switch over to the next slide. Several years ago in 2020, California passed the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act. That was very similar to the GDPR, not quite as staunch, not quite as strong. It had some teeth, but it wasn't nearly as bad. It wasn't 4% of annual revenue worldwide for sure.
Massive.
Yeah, but it applies to any organizations that serve California citizens. You can see there on the list, they either earn $25 million a year, or they have to collect personal data of 50,000 California citizens, or 50% of your revenue comes from selling data of California citizens. So think like some of those marketing companies that collect data and share it and all that kind of stuff. So there's some complexity here. When the CCPA came out, it was really focused on giving people control of their data and letting them request to opt out, and finding companies who don't do that, or giving people the ability to, or requiring companies to notify them in cases of breaches and that kind of thing. In 2023, in 2020, they passed the California Privacy Rights Act, which didn't have any teeth at the time, but it went into effect January 1st. So we saw that just 8 months ago. The CPRA went into effect that basically extends the CCPA, getting all my acronyms together. The biggest changes here are very similar to the GLBA changes. There's more obligations about specifically how you protect personal data. There's more details on notification requirements and that sort of thing. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but effectively what they're trying to do is make it much more GDPR-like. Again, we're not seeing any progress on a federal standard like this, but there are 4 other states, and I don't remember what those are offhand. 4 other states have laws that are currently in the works, like they haven't been passed, ratified, whatever. I see the little bill dancing around on the Congress steps. If you grew up in the 80s, They haven't gone through that whole process yet. But I think we'll start to see more states passing very similar stuff like this in the future.
All right.
All right, your turn, Bill. I think C is next.
All right, CMMC. This one has had a ride. So this is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. And the idea here is that anyone that has to deal with the Defense Industrial, the DIB.
Complex.
I lost complex. Yes, I lost my acronym. I forgot the industrial base. That's what it is. Are going to have to get some basic data protection security if they deal with certain types of DoD information. Now, one of the biggest changes that has happened with this. So, step back for a second. This actually was initiated roughly almost 2 years ago, and when this first came out. So this is going to pass from the DoD over to what's it called? The OMB, which would be the
Office of Management and Budget.
Office. Yes, thank you. See, too many acronyms.
I know.
It's way too many acronyms. So during that process, the DoD says this is going to be a massive overhaul, and we're going to take all this information and we're going to begin to codify it. And so just the fact that they're doing this, because initially the CMMC was part of a 2 different rules, and they were submitted together. But because of this one, there was some pushback on this one as far as when it could be applied, when it could be implemented. They actually split this one out so they could deal with it separately and not hold up the other. Now, initially, this is supposed to deal with your NIST SP 800, 171, and 172 protection regulations. And the main change here is that initially when they first drafted this, there were 5 different levels of certification that you could get. So this has gone from CMMC 1.0 to CMMC 2.0. And this new version actually better fits with other federal requirements, because it's split now. Instead of 5 different levels, you're split into 3, which is where you've got a foundational, you've got advanced, you've got expert, and each of those different levels determine the level of sensitivity of DoD contract information that you could, as a contractor, as either a primary contractor or a subcontractor, that you can handle and you can deal with. Now, some of the other changes they've done with this is, we were talking about the rollout period, because right now they're still in the rulemaking process. When this initially started, they said this may take 9 months, it may take 2 years. We're actually just now short of the 2-year mark, coming up in, I believe it's November. And it was just recently, I want to say within the past month, that this rule has been finalized on the DoD side and has been pushed over to the OMB, to the Office of Management and Budget. And so one thing to keep in mind with this is, before, we would get periodic updates. The CMMC is here. These are some of the changes. Here's some of they would have conversation about what they're doing, why they're doing it, for people to be able to follow along. Once it goes to the OMB, the DoD is not allowed to weigh in on this anymore, because now it's under review. Right now it's being evaluated. And so they're not allowed to discuss this publicly. And so what you'll find is, even though we had regular updates, I would expect that from this point going forward, now that this has actually been submitted, until it gets passed, then the likelihood of us hearing much about yes, no, maybe is probably fairly low. And there's actually two possible options that can come from this. It can either be a proposed rule, which is the normal way that they'll do it. A proposed rule is usually fairly slow. There's a process around it. They'll meet. And the main difference here is that the DoD is able to adjudicate and respond to public comments, whereas if they pass it as an interim final rule, it means that it would be in effect immediately before the DoD is required to adjudicate or respond to public comments. And so there's some variation as to when this is actually going to be enforceable.
Right.
In like if it follows the normal timeline, the normal patterns they use for the federal rollouts and the time blocks they have to roll these out, you're looking at this being as late as Q4 of 2025.
Oh, wow.
The problem is, on average, for the people to go in and actually get these different certifications and to train their people, right, to go through all the certification process, and this is going to also include technical controls, administrative controls, other things that the business would have to implement to deal with that level of classification of data. It can take anywhere from 12 to 18 months. So the actual implementation period is relatively long. And if they start now, there's a chance that they could be ready, but they don't know for sure. They don't know for certain if there's going to be adjustments or modifications to the rule before the final rule is actually passed.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges that I've seen with a lot of folks is they haven't had to deal with cybersecurity at all. And so a lot of folks that are looking at CMMC, this is the first time, maybe they're in manufacturing or some type of other industry. And they're like, holy crap, we got to do what? And, they have this huge list of like you're talking 12 to 18 months just to start implementing this, and lots of money you got to pour into resource, the necessary resources. It can be a challenge.
With the possibility of those implementation requirements changing.
Yeah.
Right. So you're caught between, do I do it now and then try to adjust things later, or do I wait as long as I can?
Yeah.
Because waiting a year, I mean, that's a lot of time for resources, and even to just find out what the final result is going to be. Another thing to mention on this is, because I've done DoD contracting in the past, there are entities, right? There are organizations who are familiar with these, but it's recommended, not required.
Yeah.
And so some of those changes, we're like, yes, we tend to do. In fact, there was one article I read dealing with companies who had said, yes, we have a maintenance plan. We are intending to do all of these requirements sometime in the future. And so they're trying to game the system. And so this is going to be one of those things where they're not going to be able to do that, because at some point they're not going to be able to handle whatever level of classification that those primary or subcontracting contracts require.
Yep.
Let's see. Is there anything else interesting about this? This will be for anyone that's dealing with the controlled unclassified information, CUI, or federal contract information.
Yep.
Oh, they also have requirements for level 1 that you can self-assess. So if you're trying to get level 1, your certification, you can self-assess, send that in, and then they may audit you at some time in the future. They may not, but you have the ability to self-assess. Level 2 and level 3, that's where you get into other auditors. Level 2, you'll have to have an external auditor. You can still do partial self-assessment, but level 3, you actually have to have a government official teaching the certification course. Right. So there's a few, depending on the level, depending on the sensitivity, there's a few different requirements when it comes to actually getting the certification and what you can do on a year-to-year basis. Normally it's 3 years. Self-assessments for level 1, that's annually. And I think those are the main points on that.
Okay. Well, our last one, as we're getting near the top of the hour here, this probably applies to the smallest number of people, but it's I feel like it has a surprisingly large reach. A lot of people are talking about this and the implications on this. So the New York Department of Financial Services, which seems like a small, I mean, it's not the Parks and Rec, right? But it seems like a small little, government agency. But what they've done is they basically said it started out with any financial services that operate in New York. They've got to comply with some additional cybersecurity regulations. I think the original one, oh man, I didn't write this down and I lost track. This has been around for 4, 5, 6 years now, I think. Basically what it applies to is companies that have 2,000 employees or more and $20 million in revenue and operations in New York. That's a fairly small, as far as financial services companies go. Those aren't huge companies, but they're not small either. Or companies that have $1 billion in revenue over the last 2 years. So, right, if you're at that $500,000 or whatever, you probably comply with this. So there's a lot of it that pulls in a lot of companies that maybe otherwise wouldn't necessarily be targeted. There's some details on there about what it means to do operations in New York and how that applies to New York citizens and all that. I don't want to get into all that detail. This is one of those that if you have to comply with it, if you're in financial services, you're probably aware of it. If you're not in the financial services industry, you probably don't care much. But what's interesting about this, kind of like we've said with with GLBA and with the CPRA, it's bringing the language more in line with other requirements. It's very similar to GDPR. It's very similar to some of the requirements with GLBA and stuff like that. Last November, the NYDFS put out a proposal that basically significantly increased the requirements for these cybersecurity regulations. They basically put it out with a request for comments that closed, I think, just a few days ago. I want to say it was mid-August of this year. I don't know what the timeline is of when that will be approved and completely validated, but everybody expects that it will be coming very soon, that these additional changes will go into effect. Some of the additional stuff there, I've listed the critical ones. More requirements around incident notification specifics. Again, that's very reminiscent of the verbiage in the CPRA that we talked about earlier. More governance and board approval of security policies. Again, we talked about that with GLBA. There's a lot of focus with the different cybersecurity regulations on making sure the board of directors knows what's going on and that you don't just have one person that's telling them what they want to hear, right? Like maybe you've got a information security manager and he figured out, if I tell them everything's great, I get my budget and everything's wonderful. If I tell them things are bad, then they'll fire me. Right. They're trying to find ways to get around that type of bottleneck and make sure the board is actually making valid decisions based on legitimate information. They increased the requirements for MFA, multi-factor authentication. So there were some very limited requirements in the previous version. Now they've basically said, hey, MFA has to be standard on not quite everything, but basically everything, right? If it's important, it needs MFA on it. We've been saying that as a consulting company for years now. If it has any kind of significance to it and you don't have MFA, that's a problem. They also increased requirements for annual pen tests, vulnerability assessments, risk assessments, audits. There's several different specific types of requirements there. Again, similar to some of the other things that we've seen in other ones. They've also added some requirements for third-party service providers. And this is where companies like Secure Ideas maybe come into play. Or if you provide services to a financial services company, you may fall under some of the requirements here. This is very similar to the way PCI handles this, the way HIPAA handles this, that sort of thing. If you're a service provider that provides a product or a service to a financial services company, you now have a contractual obligation with them to basically follow these standards. And so that's going to pull in a lot more people than maybe otherwise would. I think one of the other requirements is now you're required to have a CISO, a Chief Information Security Officer, which, I mean, if you're a company of 2,000 employees, you should probably have a CISO anyway. But now they're making it very clear. It's no longer an option. And then the last thing is just lots of documentation. With any of these compliance standards and regulations, there's lots of documentation to make sure that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing and that it can be validated and tested against and all that sort of thing. So we link to a reference there that summarizes in a little bit more detail some of that kind of stuff.
it's actually interesting to me to see how several of these baseline security requirements are converging across so many different industries, right? And so many different regulatory bodies.
Yep. They're very clearly looking at each other and saying, "Oh, that's a good idea. We should implement that too." Oh, hey, yeah, that's a good idea. Funny story. Since we got just a couple minutes here, the original PCI, and I'll talk about this in my class. The original PCI DSS that came out still has 12 requirements. The DSS has 12 requirements. Those 12 requirements are almost identical to a security program that Visa has called the CISP, Card Information. I don't remember what CISP stands for. I should probably, but that was their like 1990s information security standard that merchants had to agree with. Basically, when the card brands formed PCI, they took Visa's 12 CISP requirements and modified them a little bit and became the DSS. But those original 12 requirements, where would you think they come from? If you're in the 1990s and you're like, hey, we need to have a security requirement, where do you start with?
Definitely.
Any idea?
That's the first one. I think it was federal.
Yeah. So there were no federal requirements back then, or nothing significant. What they did is they just started searching on forums of like, hey, what's good ideas? What's best practices for information security, whatnot. I'm guessing like Alta Vista, because I don't think Google was around back then.
No,
I don't know. Yahoo maybe. But basically, it was a couple of lawyers. I've got a friend who worked with some of these lawyers, and they basically said, hey, here's 12 requirements. What do you think? Are these good enough? And
they're IRC.
Like, yeah, I was like, yeah, I guess that's a starting spot, and then we'll grow from there. And it's funny now, 25 years later, we've still got basically the same framework that's based on.
That is interesting. I wouldn't have thought that.
Yeah.
1990s version of what's it called? Hold on. Go ahead. I'll think of it.
Okay. Well, let's wrap it up. We've got one more slide here. Just some tips and tricks and things if you're dealing with regulations of FidoNet. If you're dealing with these, here are some things like advice that we give to our customers all the time that we strongly recommend. One, there is a place for checkbox security, but be careful with it. Here's an example. We have customers come all the time. They're like, I have to have a PCI test. And we were like, all right, here's how you should do it. This is what a good pen test should include. Here's what we recommend. And you'll get the most efficacy, the most efficiency, the most value out of this testing. And they're like, no, I want the bare minimum. I want to check the box and move on. Okay. I hate that, right? If that's your game, we'll maybe jump through some hoops and play it with you. But don't do that. Like if you're going to pay for testing and you're going to go through the process anyway, focus on the security aspect side of it and get value out of that. Now there are exceptions. We have clients that, in fact, I'm thinking of a large insurance client that we have that they do a very detailed, full-on penetration test. They do lots of assessments every year, but those are way beyond the scope of compliance. And if they turn in those details to their auditors, the auditors will ask all kinds of questions that are out of scope. So they have us do a simplified checkbox pen test every year of just the PCI environment so they can give that report to the auditors and avoid all the other questions. They're going way above and beyond security in everything else, but they're using the checkbox security model to handle the auditors, basically. So there are some, like I said, there's some reasonable ways to approach that, but just be careful with it. The second one is don't get surprised. Don't say, like, I don't know how many people I've talked to. They're like, yeah, I know we fall under that compliance requirement, but we're going to put it off. Like, I don't want to know. Don't tell me. If I don't know, it's not my fault. That's not the way fines work when it comes to regulation. Use those compliance requirements to fund better security, right? Like you don't have to, you're like, hey, we found this issue. Great. Let's be intentional about it. And then the last one is you can't be an expert in everything, but you can build a network of relationships with people, of trusted advisors. I've got people, right? Like if I need to know about anything related to NERC SIP, I'm going to call Bill and be like, hey, fill me in here because I know there's something that I don't know. I don't remember the details. Or if I've got an application security question, I'm probably going to call Mick or Jason and be like, hey, help me out, remind me of this. But having those trusted advisors just, gives you so much more capabilities, I guess. You got anything to add there, or should we hand it over to Jason?
Oh, that was fantastic.
Awesome. Well, Jason, you want to wrap us up?
Yeah. So we're down to about 3 seconds. So
Perfect.
Perfect timing. Yes. Thanks all for joining us. And thank you very much, Bill and Nathan, for the more exciting than I was expecting talk about the regulatory landscape, which is really cool. Next week, we have on the schedule a bird's eye view navigating the landscape of Kubernetes security. So for those of you dealing with containers, Kubernetes environments, that's a definite must-go that will be presented by our very own Corey Sable. So we'll see you then.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, everyone.